All right, I think our technical issues have been resolved, so we're back up on the live stream with full audio. So we'll proceed with the rest of the hearing.
Where Delegate Watson's up next.
Thank you. A couple quick questions. One, can you just confirm that the university doesn't appoint the board members for these three entities? I can't imagine that they still do. Is that correct?
We don't appoint any of the board members for Helio Campus, though we have a person from Ventures who helps represent our, because we still have some percentage in there. One of our people is somebody who actually works with that board.
Okay, back up and please repeat that.
So we don't appoint the board of Helio Campus.
Understood?
There is a seat on the Helio Campus board for UMGC Ventures.
Okay,
because
because they
they-
still have some ownership there?
Yes.
Okay,
And the Ventures Board, I don't appoint all the members. In this case, more than half of the members are appointed by the chair, but they have not set in place a separate process for putting board members in place.
but you only appointed the original ones? I mean, you're not continuing to appoint board members to that entity, are you?
Yes, I can still appoint board members to it. Yes.
How does that not violate the IRS regulations for nonprofit?
Well, this is one of those questions that we continue to work with the study, because there's this question of, is it a half? What does independence actually connote? When you're talking about what is half, is it the appointment of the chair?
What percentage do you appoint?
I haven't, of the current board, I could appoint up to half, but
Okay, 50%?
Yes, but
Okay.
of those groups, the current group, I have not appointed anywhere near that number. The current chair appointed almost all these board members.
So the IRS doesn't define to you or in their regulations what they mean by control?
This is what we're trying to work on the study to help make sure we have a good sense of it.
What's the endowment of UMUC now?
The endowment.
The value of the endowment.
What was that again?
The value of our,
Foundation.
For the sale of Helio?
No, I was looking at an article that is on the website for, was on the website for one of these ventures, and it said that, it quotes, that one of the reasons you have done this to spin these entities off was to increase your endowment, which at the time was 16 million, I believe, which was felt to be below average.
Yeah, so the last time I looked at the value of that was in the spring. It was approximately 21 million.
Did any of that come from any of these entities?
Yes, so the sale of Helio, the $16 million went into the foundation. Actually, there was some talk about the overall sale, what happened to the proceeds. 16 million went into the foundation. It has grown to 21 million. We have offered about 1.6 million in scholarships last year. I think we're doing about
Okay.
1.4 million this year. The remaining proceeds went back into Helio.
Okay, thank you.
But just to be clear on Delegate Watson's question, Mr. Sergi, you serve on the UMGC Ventures Board, right?
As an ex officio, that is correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you were appointed by the president?
It's by position as the chief operating officer.
So by UMGC Ventures bylaws, the chief operating officer of UMGC serves as a board member,
That's correct.
Yes, right, non-voting.
non-voting board member. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you again for coming to give us some information. And you brought up some issues a little while ago, and I want you to know that we consider UMGC an asset, and we do appreciate what you do. But as elected officials, it's our responsibility to the citizens and the taxpayers to make sure that we have accountability and oversight for tax dollars that are spent. That's why we do the audits. That's why we look to make sure the state's getting the best bang for the buck and it benefits the taxpayers. So I think we need to make sure that we're not questioning what you do, but we're being good stewards of the tax dollars in Maryland. So I know it's been a while, but we know what we spent in the last 6 years on IT. Do you know what your annual IT costs were when you had your folks in-house?
We have that,
Can we get that? Can you
Yes.
get that to us?
you bet.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
thing. I guess one of the problems I have with these audits is that we're here now talking about problems that have been going on for years, and we're talking about how we're going to address them, we're going to study them, and I do appreciate that, but I just wonder what we're doing now to prevent having to come back here like this. These are, in my world, these are questions that I would have answered prior to being here. I would have known why I was doing things, I'd have all that information. And I think it's key because this isn't just your dollars, this is taxpayers' monies we're spending. And it's a very competitive market out there. And as I said, I worry seriously about the product we're putting out there, because if I can't pay off my loan, my education's not effective. And I do appreciate your comments on that. But I think more for the future is coming into an audit like this, we're kind of watching, it's kind of unprepared, and I'd like to see better what we're doing on an ongoing basis. University of Maryland, I think, should be watching these things every day of the week. They should be sitting back saying, can I justify this? It scares me that the last audit came out with no real findings, and we're all of a sudden, these are not surprises on how business runs or how any entity runs. So just saying that, I'd hope in the future we don't have to come back with this type of thing, and thank you for your presentations.
I guess to follow up on that, you know, obviously, as you described, there's a third-party review that's going on now that will report back. And I guess this may be a broader question. One, why has it taken this long to do a third-party review of these HIDA entities? Had it not been for this audit, would this third-party review even be done? And this third-party review is being done internally by all of you. Why should we have confidence in the recommendations of all of that?
So thanks, Chair. And again, the goal is to actually bring in a third party who's not tied to either of us, or the Ventures or UMGC. And we've gone through the procurement processes and made sure that we bring in someone who would give us some ability to say this is not biased one way or the other. There had been previous studies and previous audits tied to this. In fact, there had been one in 2022 that talked about, are you getting the best value for your dollar? That one was done in a way that leads us to believe we do need to bring in a third party to even look at that work as well. But it is definitely the right time to do that because, in part, the industry continues to change very rapidly. So getting someone in here to do that will help us have an understanding of what is viable and what's not.
So did you just say that there was a review done in 2022 that of whether we were getting the best value for our dollar, and that concluded that we were?
Yes.
Okay.
But again, that one was done by the UMGC. To the question you just asked a minute ago,
That was done by who again?
That was done by UMGC Ventures. So being able to say that.
They were just looking at IT costs. Self-regulating. Yeah, but they were just looking at the IT costs.
Okay.
So, which is one of the reasons why we're having a third party even look at that work as well.
Okay. Maybe this is a question for the USM board, because it's the USM board that we designated in statute that was originally passed in 2012 to allow HIDAs to be created. And I think ultimately the USM board has to approve of the creation of these HIDAs. Does the USM board not have a responsibility then to follow up and make sure that the reason that these HIDAs were created was justified in its existence, and that it actually provided the value at which was provided to you, to the board members, as to why this was originally created?
We do, and we get reports that show that they're doing what they were designed to do. But again, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, the thresholds are pretty low. And that's something that we really have decided we need to work on. Are those thresholds the right thresholds going forward? But when they were set up, there were very specific things that have been ticked off each year. And I totally agree with you that they're easy to tick off. But they have been checked each year, and each year they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. So far, they have met those thresholds.
So is your contention that the board basically checked the boxes and therefore didn't have to further review what was going on with these HIDAs? That there were 6 criteria based in the statute as to what they had to meet to continue to exist. And based on the documentation I think that we got from USM itself, the criteria basically was that they generated at least $1 million of revenue.
Right.
That was the basic criteria that all of the HIDAs had met. Seems like a pretty low bar.
We
It didn't
agree.
strike anyone at USM at the board level that it's a pretty low bar, that you may want to come forward or maybe do a little bit further of a review of these HIDAs as to what additional value they're bringing forward?
And each year we review that, and hence the study that's going on and the one that went on in '22. Those studies were designed to see if we're competitive with today's marketplace. And the study said we were, and now we're doing a completely independent study to see if that makes sense.
But it didn't occur to the board to do a completely independent study before this, right? Because the 2022 was basically UMGC Ventures studying itself, kind of navel gazing. The study now is, I guess, only triggered by OLA, that it doesn't sound like this study would be ongoing or started had it not been for OLA's audit to come back. There was no discussion at the board level as to why these HIDAs exist, and should we increase the threshold by which they're justified to continue?
There was not.
Okay. It seems like, you know, Dr. Berman, you had mentioned that part of the reason, and I think this obviously predates your tenure as the chancellor here, that part of this was that these HIDAs would generate enough revenue or innovate or have enough entrepreneurial activities, as you stated, to offer additional support for students in programming and such, and scholarships. But the audit cites the fact that 198 million of the 215 million of revenue that Ventures generated was actually from UMGC itself, that 198 of the 215 million in revenue that UMGC Ventures generated was actually coming from UMGC, its parent. And so, you know, I wonder whether that actually meets the spirit of why we created these HIDAs when, you know, the thought was that it would help them innovate, would help them create entrepreneurial activities, and yet 90+% of the revenue from Ventures is actually coming from UMGC.
Well, I certainly don't dispute the analysis you just made. I stand by the intent, and I think we never like to fail, but in trying to execute on the intent, I think there's some issues that you raised that are totally valid.
I was going to say, just to pull on the thread from Senator Lamb, I think, so, and I think to clarify, the 2022 audit that was done by Ventures was not an analysis of HIDA as a concept. It was an analysis to just make sure that our IT contract was well within essentially the competitive range. So they're very different. The 2022 was, are we getting bang for our buck just on IT contracting? What you were doing is looking at analysis right now of HIDA, of the concept of UMGC Ventures. But I think the question that I would want a commitment from you all is, because I think there's a lot of interest among the committee and the legislature, from the Regent's perspective and the USM perspective, do we need to reevaluate how HIDAs are created, how they are held accountable, how they are evaluated each year? And I think, can we get a commitment from the USM and from the Regents that we're going to do that?
Delegate Solomon, first of all, and maybe I should have pointed this out before, if you're wondering how many HIDAs we have across the system, you've heard of this today about 3 of the 4.
Yeah.
There is only one other. It's called the Maryland Development Center. It's a UMCP HIDA, and it's intended to use that entity to facilitate startups. So there are only 4. As you heard from the chair, and I will tell you from my office, we evaluate them yearly, and we report to the state by October 1. Again, as I said before, and I think as the auditor said, If we're going to continue with HIDAs, and I hope that whatever is done doesn't dampen the intent and the encouragement by you all to find ways to use our expertise to generate revenue, I think it's what needs to be tightened up is the alignment here. These are worthwhile activities. They're done with good motivation. There's a set of rules that need to be followed.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
And I'm committed to that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, again,
And
we
the
all.
board is as well.
Great, thank you. And so the question I guess I would have for Ms. Herbst, from your perspective, and I know we were talking about this a little bit earlier, it's troubling to me that essentially we have an exemption for the HIDAs. And again, it's, we're talking about these three entities in specific here. And there's almost no ability for your office to look at the contracts, to Delegate Aaron's point, or to the procurements until after the fact, until well down the road. And do you think that's a problem?
I understand why the exemption is there involved to encourage this more entrepreneurial activity.
Sorry, we may have to pause. We just had another tech. I think that mic is very sensitive, so anyone who pulls on that.
Wait, see if that works.
Yeah, give me 1 second, yeah, you're good.
It's got a bad connection or something. Check 1, check 2. Thank you, Chair Solomon. I understand the exemption as it's written in the law, and I understand the purpose for it. I will say this independent third party who's actually started their work, and I know this because I'm on the executive group overseeing this work. And so this will come to the system. And I have already been a part of the kickoff meeting and the follow-on meetings. So we intend to be active with UMGC. That was UMGC's idea.
Yeah.
And so we appreciate that.
Well, and I was going to say, and I had said this to Dr. Fowler earlier, obviously, a lot of these things were put in place before many of you were here. And so we're, again, we're dealing with it after the fact, but I think we're trying to get to a place where we don't have this happen again. And we haven't, there's been so much other pieces. I'm particularly frustrated by the Accelerate subcontract. We basically lost $26 million. And I'm particularly frustrated that we didn't have the liquidation clause. I have questions when we get to the system overview of the region's policies on that. But I guess, Dr. Fowler, I know you all have consulted with the Attorney General on the liquidation piece because there wasn't a liquidation clause in here. And I'm not a lawyer, and I have obviously not seen the contract, but it seems to me like the subcontractor was giving you all misleading information that up until that third party came, and again, I appreciate that when you came in, you had an outside entity essentially look at what the subcontractor was doing to see whether we were meeting any of those benchmarks. But it seemed like all along, if we were supposed to go live in 2021, they were telling you we're on point, we're ready to hit those benchmarks, and then suddenly, literally several months before it was supposed to go live, it was a completely different story. And so again, I'm not a lawyer, but it would strike me that if that subcontractor, maybe through Accelerate, was giving UMGC information that they were meeting benchmarks and then all of a sudden they weren't, that they were misleading you. And whether we had a liquidation clause in there or not, I'm perplexed as to why we can't take any legal action against the subcontractor to recoup some of that money.
Thanks, Chair. I will certainly go back to, we've gotten some feedback from our general counsel and the Attorney General's office. I'll certainly go back and revisit that topic.
Okay. And then the last question sort of gets wrapped up into the HIDA conversation and maybe part of the sort of broader regions policy that we're going to be working on with the USM. What decision is made? So we have these. It's great to hear that we're continuing to do the commercialization, and again, to get to the intent of what we were trying to get at with the HIDAs to begin with. How do we decide how much money goes back? So, you mentioned a loft in your testimony. If a loft turns out to be wonderful, right? We get 15 contracts from around the country. Who makes the determination? Is it UMGC Ventures board to decide that 10% of the revenue that we get from a loft comes back to UMGC? Does it all sit at UMGC Ventures? Who's making that decision?
I think that. Yes, I think that that's one of those questions that we'll have to take a look at as part of the work ahead, which is if these things are productized, is there a set formula in place? Is there a specific percentage that automatically comes back? We don't have a specific thing in place currently to do so, but we certainly will make sure if that is the case for a loft or any of the other things that I mentioned, that we do put something in place for that.
Mr. Herbst, it looks like
No, I was just going to say, there is nothing in place today that's specific about that, and I know that's part of what is being looked at.
Okay, so there's nothing either at the UMGC side or at the region side. I think that is also concerning because you're exactly right. If we are trying to figure out ways, if we have wonderful innovations that are coming out of our institutions that we want to commercialize, we should have some formal policy in place that talks about what the split is, how much money is coming back. And I think that is, I know that's concerning to me. I think that's concerning to the committee as well. So I think we have a lot of work to do going forward. And then I saw Senator, we'll go Delegate Watson and then Senator Hedelman.
Be brief. It's really a question for both Mr. Tannen and you guys. But to Mr. Tannen, I would say, if we removed the exemptions, would that solve our problems from his perspective? But then also I would say to you, if we removed the exemptions, would that cripple your ability to carry out the mission that you're trying to carry out? And the point is, you may have read the papers today, but our state budget is basically 86% of our state budget is funded for future years. In other words, we have a 14% gap in all the expenses that we are projecting. We do not have the capacity for this kind of extra spending that we don't have control over. And so it's almost frustrating to hear about the study because it's going to take too long before we can get this under control. So I do have that concern. You don't have to answer it, but would it cripple you to have procurement guidelines in place?
I think we'd have to go through in some more detail how the procurement process works for the various pieces. What I would say is that a lot of the innovation that we are doing, going back, I believe, to Delegate Here's question earlier, is really on how do we help the students who have not been served well, and a lot of that innovation, whether it is how do we reach rural students, how do we create various types of technologies that allow for various underserved populations. So that level of innovation is one of the things that we'd want to try to talk about as part of the procurement process to say, are there places and ways that we can take that into consideration as we are thinking about innovation as we continue to move forward? So that would be my response.
I mean, I understand the mission, but it feels as though we're too far off to one side in terms of not having control over the procurement process and what that means or doesn't mean in terms of wasted dollars to the state. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. At the risk of beating a dead horse, which is a horrible saying, but I don't understand the mission. I think I just have to say, if the mission is to provide, if the primary mission is to provide education services, online education services, and I totally understand the reason for that, and I totally buy into the mission. At the same time, I am struggling with, it feels like you're trying to also be an ed tech business. Mm-hmm. And so I guess I need to understand, and I think we all maybe, if you could comment on that, because it feels like it's neither fish nor fowl, and you're part of a system, and you're part of the University of Maryland system, which seems totally appropriate to me. And at the same time, and look, I remember talking about these entities as they were coming online. in a different, when I was on the House side, on the Appropriations Committee. But it is really troubling to me that we don't know when we're creating these ed tech ventures, that we don't know what we're getting back. And then if we're selling them, like Helio, you know, kind of where that money is going. And if the purpose of those entities is to be creative and to be there for UMGC and other online education entities, then it seems like from the get-go, those kinds of pretty fundamental, essential questions should have been part of the design. And so that is really troubling to me. And could you comment on that? Look, we all want our folks in the military and people who can't use sort of more traditional, you know, in-person higher education institutions to have these services. But do you see yourself as primarily an educational institution or a business educational venture?
So the mission has always been, 77 years now, to figure out how to provide education to people in places and ways that they could not, who otherwise won't have an opportunity to do that. To do that requires what are the tools and technologies that will allow us to do it, and to know where and when we're not being successful at that. And that's changing very, very rapidly.
Right.
A quick, simple example of that is the work that's going on right now with artificial intelligence and machine learning. And trying to find ways to integrate those in ways that allow us to know in real time whether or not a student whether they are in Japan or in Texas or here in Prince George's County is succeeding or not, particularly students who have not been successful in the past and often have accrued debt. Requires us to have those technologies in place that allow us to know things that we have not known before, and to create things that we have not done before. So it is not an either or in our head. We can't serve our mission if we don't have the tools to do that, and those tools are rapidly changing in ways that require us to be aware of everything from what's possible to these cybersecurity challenges that are tied to it. So to do one well and to continue getting well at it, we have to have that second piece in place of what are the technologies that will help us be better at this for students who, as you know, more than, you got 40 million Americans who have some college and no degree, generally because college has failed them. And our job is to try to figure out how do we not be part of that, but actually create new ways for them to succeed.
I understand that, but it's a confusing, and it may be biting off more than what one entity is capable of doing. I'll just leave it at that.
And I will say, I mean, even in our conversations down here in Annapolis, we have said that for UMGC, we have to create the infrastructure. It is not going to be bricks and mortar. It is going to be a virtual ecosystem that requires us to be more dynamic in what we're trying to do. It's a challenge and a sort of mind shift for a lot of the people who we engage with, but trying to create that's going to be absolutely critical, or else we're going to find ourselves not just simply losing out to some of our competitors, but losing out for our students.
Thank you.
I have a few follow-up questions that don't pertain to the HIDA, but also pertain to the advertising piece that was identified in here. You know, it looks like $500 million was approved over 6 years by the Board of Public Works for marketing and advertising. The audit also pointed out that when they ran a test or examination in a test market, Philadelphia, for example, in FY23, $18 million spent, only 212 students added. $18 million, 212 students added in a test market of Philadelphia. We're spending a lot of money on advertising and marketing, right? There could be an open discussion on whether or not some of that money for marketing and advertising maybe could go directly to scholarships or being able to provide direct tuition remission for students to be able to enroll. You mentioned that this amount of money needs to be spent in order to stay competitive with your competitors, I guess, which is Western Governors University, University of Southern New Hampshire. At what point, who made the decision that those are the competitors of UMGC? Is that a decision made by UMGC itself, or is that a decision made at the USM level that, you know, because our competitors to this institution are Southern New Hampshire University and Western Governors University, we need to spend this much, and it just seems like a perpetual arms race to be able to bring more students in. At what point is that going to stop? But that's a reflection of the fact that that's who we view as our competitors to UMGC, right? And so is that an institution decision? Is that a USM decision?
Well, I think that's in part been tied back to what the mission of UMGC has been for the last 77 years. And it is in part to be a good collaborator with our schools within the state, but also to even more so be the online institution that services the military around the globe. And that includes certainly here within the U.S., but also, as I said, in the 20 foreign countries that we serve in. To do that well and to be that school of choice, and in fact, sometimes to actually make them aware of the opportunities that they do have with that, requires us to actually be in that space in that type of way.
Does the USM system believe that the competitors of UMGC should be University of Southern Maryland and Western Governors? Is that, I mean, even if it wasn't to name those two institutions, is that the direction at which, at a Board of Regents level, the USM system is envisioning where UMGC should be going?
Well, I would comment in direct response to your question that the decision as to who the competitors are is left in the hands of the experts. So the system does not dictate who the competitors are from a business perspective. We do compare our institutions to peers. Each institution has a set of peers, and the institutions that are perceived, the ones you named and others, that are perceived as direct competitors in the marketplace are also seen as peers. So in that respect, we approve who the institution thinks its peers are. But in terms of who's competing from a business perspective, that's the president's decision and his team.
But by approving who the peers of that institution are, aren't you setting the priorities of where you think that institution should be reaching towards and being compared to?
Well, I think that what we're talking about when we talk about peer institutions is academic performance much more than it is business perspective.
I see, okay. So the business perspective is left to the institution
I think
itself.
With all due respect, Senator, that's where the expertise is.
Okay. Because I mean, you know, I could foresee that there could be a discussion on a policy of whether or not we as the legislature believe that that we should have UMGC aspiring to compete against University of Southern Maryland, Western Governors University. That's a lot of money to continue to try to aspire towards, right? And so, you know, they may have very different objectives, they may have different goals. You know, I don't know if we as a legislature, I don't think we've certainly made any decisions whether that's a good aspiration to be reaching towards from a business perspective, right? But that's certainly one that the university, that UMGC is moving towards. And so in order to sustain that, you need to continue to have a significant marketing and advertising budget to do that.
That is true, and it is one of the reasons why we believe that we need to make sure we are aware of what they are doing. But it's also to point out something that was said a little while ago, that a lot of the revenue that comes from that market is what actually continues to fund UMGC. So about 85% of our budget does come from the work that we are doing with adult learners and the national space, while we are trying to move forward with about 15% coming from the state. So being able to continue to serve that market well means being able to think about how do we continue to reach out and also support those in a very strong competitive market online and with adult learners. Again, I think it still also goes back to our mission is not necessarily to be competitive with our sister and brother institutions within the system. It really is to be able to reach the students in different ways, both here within the state, around the country, and around the globe that serve in the military as well. And to do that and to be the school of choice for those means that we've got to be able to find ways to actually put our name out there.
And I think that's a laudable mission. I don't question the need to serve our service members and their educational needs as well. I think it's just a question of at what cost, right? Is it worth the $500 million in advertising and marketing that we have to go through every couple years to be able to reach those individuals to bring them into UMGC?
So that 500 million is a spend authorization. It is not spent. So of that authorization, the UMGC spent 320 million, not 500 million. And that's over that 6-year period. In terms of the concern around the activity that we have in our competitors, I mean, that's just the reality of the market. All USM institutions are competitive and have their own set of institutions that they're competing either within the state of Maryland or more broadly in the Northeast or nationally. So the way that we look at it and we look at our competitors, I mean, that's the reality when we look at what's happening within the Maryland market. We know that those institutions are advertising heavily here. And we have to compare the business model of what we're gaining in revenue from the marketing spend relative to the state appropriation. So we constantly look at, we have over 30,000 Maryland residents that we are supporting actively. And when you look up and against the appropriation is below per student what the community colleges are funded. So the reality is, as other USM institutions use their enrollments to fund and offset areas where the financial margin is not as desired, some students have, because of scholarships, tuition levels and things like that, you offset some of your losses with some of your gains. So the business model of going out beyond Maryland actually helps us to provide outreach, and a quality education to the university, to the Maryland residents, without coming back to this body to ask for additional appropriation, which, as President Fowler mentioned, our appropriation is only 12% of the total operating costs.
Can I just add, and when we think about the investment in the marketing, what we often think about is what are we going to generate as a result of that? And so when we project out the 60 million over the lifetime value of the students that we're going to be working with, that 60 million will actually generate close to 140 million in revenue during that period of time as well. So on one hand, it is a substantial amount, but again, it is also very much something that we look at from a business model as an investment that does pay off in the long run.
And maybe if the system folks could follow up with information about how much is spent by each of the institutions when it comes to advertising and marketing. I understand your model is a little bit different than probably some of these other institutions, but proportionally, it seems like a lot to be spending $1/3 billion on marketing and advertising to bring in folks. And then just in closing my questions then for the board, if you can follow up and let us know, is the board tracking how much state money is being provided to each of these HIDAs in order to generate and meet at least that $1 million external revenue threshold? It sounds like the board has not been tracking this up to this point. Of how much money is actually, how much state money is actually going towards these HIDAs in order to ensure that they're meeting that threshold of $1 million of external revenue.
We do track that.
You do track that?
We do track that. We don't track how much state money is going into them, but we will add that. Yeah, we track really 3 things today. We track, are they meeting their goals? Are they meeting the thresholds? And should we continue their certificate as a result of those things? And so those are the 3 things that we're tracking today, but we will also track if any state money is going to them. And I do say if.
Okay, well, there was substantial state money that went to them to start them.
But that was some time ago.
But it seems like it's not entirely clear how much has come back.
Well, I think there is. I think we just keep going away from it. The 16 million that came back into what they call their foundation, which is directly goes to service scholarships. And those scholarships now are going out. So of the money that went out, 16.1 came back. And
But the
now-
audit report only said that there was about 1.5 million in scholarships that came back one year and about 1.5
Because
million
it went
another
into
year.
the foundation to be used for future scholarships. It's sitting in the bank, which is now 21 million. So it's not 1 million that came back, 1 million went out, or 1.6, as Greg pointed out,
Got it,
went out.
okay.
So,
And the 15 million is still, so the initial seed money that went into ventures is still retained in ventures. It has not been spent. Point of clarification.
Okay. And then if the
and
board
to
can.
the auditor's credit, they didn't see that because they didn't have the ventures information. So it's not the auditor's fault.
Well, that's because they weren't provided the information.
Exactly, that's the point. So they couldn't have said that succinctly because they didn't have those numbers.
Okay. And then if you can follow up with us on whether whether the board thinks that these HIDAs should continue to exist and what recommendations you might have for us to help put some better guardrails and boundaries around them.
Yeah, no problem.
Senator Benson.
IRS is not allowed to be involved and give certain bits of information. Is that what I heard you all in your report?
Correct.
How's IRS involved? Is IRS involved in
I think you were asking
They're
about
not?
the question of the status, the 501c3 status, and what that means is that we have to keep a certain arm's length distance because it has that federal tax status as we are trying to move. So it's not the IRS, but it's that status that they have from it's a 501c3.
Okay, I wanted to be sure that I understood that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I think in the interest of time, we appreciate UMGC and the USM folks for this piece. There's clearly a lot more conversation that needs to be had. I think we're going to call Mr. Tannen and his team back up and move on to Frostburg, the audit of Frostburg State. And then eventually USM Central Office again.
I'm afraid to touch the mic. Good afternoon, and again, for the record, Brian Tannen, Legislative Auditor. I'm going to keep my comments even briefer than my earlier comments and say this audit is about more of the same. It's dealing with exemptions. This time, instead of HIDAs, you're going to hear things like ICPAs or intergovernment cooperative purchasing agreements, or the other one from the Maryland MEEC, which stands for
Maryland Education
Consortium, or sole source. It's the same concept again and again, where there are exemptions from following normal state procurement practices. We're not here to say, to answer the question that was raised while I was in the audience, I'm not here advocating for a change necessarily in exemptions or not exemptions. That's for greater mind than myself. I'm saying we should hold true to the way we're going to treat the entity. Arm's length, then you treat them like arm's length and you monitor them like you would when you're doing business with an independent entity. You set up the controls up front to make sure we know where the funds are going to be going and what the structure of those activities are going to be. When we procure with them as if they're independent. The challenges that we're seeing with these things are that we're treating them both ways, both as independent when it comes time for accountability, and then when it comes time for using them, we're treating them in a less than arm's length manner. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike Merzak, who will be dealing with the USM findings, and Adam Westover, who will be talking about the Frostburg. In this case, we merged them together because some of the USM policies are having a direct impact on some of the institutions. In this case, Frostburg. The timing of the audit reports was fortuitous for this presentation.
Good afternoon, co-chairs and members of the committee. For the record, I'm Michael Merzak, and I was the manager of the University System of Maryland, or USMO, audit. As Brian mentioned, this presentation will actually cover two separate audit reports, both issued in September 11th of this year. Adam Westover to my right was the manager of the Frostburg State University audit and will present selected findings from that audit report. As shown on slide 2, USMO has multiple responsibilities, such as monitoring performance, providing financing via bond issuance, but the focus of today's presentation is USMO's role in developing system-wide policies and procedures. These policies and procedures apply to the 12 institutions in the 3 higher education centers of USM. These policies and procedures are commonly referred to as the Board of Regents or BOR policies. Again, Frostburg State is one of the 12 institutions of USM, and findings from that audit are pretty much case examples of the issues that we raised at the USMO system audit. Slide 3 is just a highlight of our findings from the 2 reports that will be presented today. Again, this is a summary presentation for convenience, so I'm going to move on to slide 4. Finding 1 from USMO was a policy issue. As Brian mentioned, a lot of these involve intergovernmental cooperative purchasing agreements. If you're not familiar with these, a lot of times they involve federal to state, state to state, or state to county cooperatives. And basically, these were originated to allow greater economy, to allow for more than one governmental body to obtain goods and services. Case example, if a vendor engaged in business with Penn State University to do facilities repair, could be used by Maryland University for a service that we needed at an efficient cost, this is where you would want to use an ICPA. Our policy issue was that the office had not established sufficient policies and procedures for USM institutions to follow when using contracts procured by other entities, including ICPAs. At the time of our audit, the Board of Regents policies allowed for institutions, any of the 12 USM institutions, to enter into contracts procured by other entities, provided 2 things: that the contract was awarded after a proper procurement process, and that the terms of that contract did not prohibit use by any other University System of Maryland institution. Also, the policies in place at the time of our audit required for the contract to be in the best interest of the institution. What we raised at USM was just for the institutions to document that the contracts entered into were in the best interest at the time of entering the contract. Subsequent to our audit, June 2024 this year, the board approved revisions to its procurement policies. However, the approval and revision did not add the documentation requirement we were seeking, but removed the requirement of the contract being in the best interest. We believe including a requirement for a BOO policy to make it clear that the method is not just be used for convenience or expediency, but the institution has to explain why the method best served the institution over other available procurements. Moving to slide 5 is a case of this from Frostburg State University. In that, we had a repeat finding this audit cycle at Frostburg for a condition that was seen at the prior audit of Frostburg, in that they did not document or even appear to have had any verification that the contract was in the best interest of the university. Nor did FSU ensure that the original contract had been awarded using an appropriate procurement process. Additionally, within this finding, FSU did not verify specific contract rates or charged were consistent with the contracts. These differences totaled $6.9 million. Just to point out, if you have the report for yourself, page 8, figure 3 actually shows the 9 contracts that were evaluated by the audit, including 4 contracts that were procured by other entities. Moving to slide 6 is a separate policy issue pertaining to student financial aid. In this instance, USMO did not have a policy to require institutions to consider tuition remission when awarding financial aid. For background, I think many are familiar, but USM employees and direct family members may attend USM institutions at free of cost, which is considered tuition remission. BOR policies require each individual institution develop policy guidelines for the award of aid, including the criteria based on or need for merit. However, it did not require the institutions to consider tuition remission when developing their policies. As noted in our November 1st, 2023 audit of Coppin State University, we noted that certain individuals had appeared to have taken advantage of the USM tuition remission policy and pretty much overlapping that with certain COVID relief aid. Conversely, we actually noted a separate USM institution did have a financial aid policy that considered tuition remission, and our point was that a system-wide policy would have helped ensure consistency between institutions. At this point, I'm going to turn it to Adam for the remaining FSU findings.
I just want to thank the committee again for allowing me to present our Frostburg University report findings. I'm going to try and make this quick because the nice people from Frostburg have a long drive back. If we could go to, we're on slide 7. On slide 7 is the first finding of the report. FSU did not exercise adequate due diligence or comply with procurement policies when it procured a new financial aid system. FSU subsequently determined it was not cost effective to continue using the system and discontinued it after spending $680,000. In October of 2021, FSU procured software totaling $269,000 through a sole source procurement and contracted with another vendor to implement a system for $700,000 under a Maryland Enterprise Education Consortium contract, which we refer to as a MEEC contract. FSU did not prepare a sole source justification for the software as required by Board of Regents policy. FSU did not conduct a formal analysis to determine if the system would meet the needs of Frostburg. Instead, they contacted another state university using the system who provided a favorable review. FSU selected the implementation vendor without preparing a detailed task order request proposal that would allow the other 16 MEEC vendors to propose on the contract. Although not required under the MEEC contract, it's a best practice to solicit proposals from other vendors when available. FSU activated the system for the fall 2022 semester and re-implemented its prior system beginning with the summer 24 semester. The contract did not provide liquidated damages. FSU legal counsel indicated that there are no damages to pursue. According to counsel, the vendor recommended FSU change certain business practices to align with the vendor system. However, FSU determined this change would have caused significant complications for Frostburg and asked the vendor to modify their system to accommodate Frostburg. This decision, per legal counsel, significantly impacted the project's workload and timeline by Frostburg, and they encountered challenges that other state universities did not encounter. FSU may not be able to recover the approximate $680,000 expended under both contracts. FSU agreed with the recommendations but disagreed with our analysis. Specifically, they disagreed that adequate due diligence was not performed and that a $680,000 loss was incurred. In regard to the due diligence, FSU acknowledged that they had no documentation of their due diligence that they had claimed to have done, and if there was no documentation, we can assert what due diligence was done. In regard to the lost funds, FSU response indicated that the loss was significantly lower because it used the system for a short period of time before discontinuing it. Since the system was not intended to be temporary, we believe that the decision to discontinue the system means the funds were lost. If you go to the next slide, please. Slide 8 is the second finding of the report. Frostburg continued to use the same vendor for student mental health services initially obtained without competition through an emergency procurement in October of 2019. And FSU did not obtain Board of Public Works approval when the contract costs exceeded $1 million. The initial contract included annual budgeted costs of approximately $640,000. FSU has continued to use the vendor for these services by extending the contract multiple times 5 years after the initial emergency, claiming that the vendor is the sole source for these services. During our audit period, the vendor was paid $1.7 million. Our review disclosed that written justification for the initial emergency contract and subsequent sole source justification were not signed until we requested them in August of 2023. We question the validity of the continuous use of sole source Given the nature of the services and no apparent attempt by Frostburg to competitively procure the services since inception of the contract, our online research identified other vendors who could potentially provide similar services. FSU did not obtain Board of Public Works approval when the total cost exceeded $1 million as required by USM policy, and did not ensure rates invoiced paid to the vendor were consistent with the contract. We reviewed 5 invoices between May and September of 2023, and we noted overpayments totaling $9,600. FSU disagreed with the recommendation related to the overpayments. As noted in our analysis and an auditor comment, there was an addendum issued on the contract in August of 2023, increasing the rates. Effective October 23, Frostburg began paying the rates prior to that date. Next slide, please. Slide 9 includes the 4 other findings from the USMO office audit, which there are 2 confidential cybersecurity findings that we don't present here. And there are 2 of the other 4 Frostburg findings. Next slide, please. This is our conclusion slide. Both audits, we issued a number of recommendations, and we'll be following up on those during the next audit of each agency. Mike and I will take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Tannen, your team. We appreciate the presentation.
If I could add one comment about Accelerate and Ventures. There was discussion about an evaluation done in 2022. We actually do comment on that evaluation in our report. I just wanted to point that out. It's on page 16 and 17 of the report, and we talk about what that review covered. So I just wanted to make you aware of that.
Just one quick question, could I? Just real quick, in all the audits you guys do, and I know you do a ton of them, you haven't witnessed stuff like this in the past where contracts are done this way just because the system allows it, or you just don't see this type of business activity, if you will?
So are we talking about the UMGC report or the second report? This second report, we have comments about ICPAs and the failure to ensure it's in the best service. We have that in other state agencies, nothing new. We have concerns about documenting sole source justifications, continuing to use emergency. That's, I hate to say it, we see that all the time. The things that we saw at UMGC,
Yeah.
I've never seen it in 30 years.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll bring forward, I guess we could probably bring forward both the teams from USM and Dr. Herman, and also from Frostburg State University, President Nosek.
Stem of the mic. Yeah. At the base. Yeah, there you go.
I guess we can proceed in the order at which the auditors presented, so maybe start with USM and then proceed to Frostburg.
Happy to. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Chair Lamb, Chair Solomon, Mr. Tannen and his team. Great thanks. I would like to start by doing something that I think needs to be done here, namely reaffirming our commitment to sustaining a tone at the top that reinforces our role as a steward of the public trust. I've shared with the presidents and leaders of all USM institutions, whether they have or do not have affiliated entities, that I expect full transparency and cooperation with OLA and its auditing teams. I've learned over my career to consider auditors as partners. Whether they're OLA's auditors or other external auditors or our own internal staff, because they make us better, they make us follow the rules, And you as our legislators and the public expects it. I haven't come lately to what I just said. As an institution president, I used to say it at the first meeting of the auditors when they come to do an audit on campus. And I recognize that now in my position, I have a responsibility to support the universities, to meet the very expectations that I've just articulated, whether it's in policy guidance or oversight or direct support of university activities. And I'll illustrate what I mean as an example. Now, the audit of the USM office is addressed in the written testimony submitted to you. As noted in our response, at the time the audit report was published, we had agreed with each of the OLA recommendations except one. However, after publication and upon public reflection, we changed our position on the finding we disagreed with, and we now agree with the finding. Our initial disagreement regarding documentation associated with contracts procured by other agencies was that such contracts have already gone through a qualified procurement process. So we therefore believe that they were already determined to be in the best interests of the state and the system. But we examined the issue further, and we realize there are situations in which it would be beneficial to document these contracts and say that they are in our mutual best interests, if that is our conclusion, and that doing so at times may even give us an opportunity to negotiate better terms. And we believe this recommendation is best addressed through a best practice memo from me, and that memo is being drafted now. You'll see in our written testimony that we've developed implementation plans for all OLA findings, and on those findings that are not yet resolved, in the written testimony, you'll find included projected completion dates. The point I wanted to make regarding an example, I want to note that the auditors had findings around IT systems at both UMGC and Frostburg State. And in response, the USM office has proposed process enhancement related to major IT projects. And so what is before the presidents now is a requirement that university presidents report each year to the USM office their overall IT strategies as well as major IT initiatives over the next 1, 3, and 5 years, those already underway and those in planning. The projected due date for the first of these reports is February 2025. We'll consolidate the reports and provide them as a yearly overview to the Board of Regents. Also, the system office will conduct project health checks throughout the year, which may include independent verification and validation assessments, project peer review, meetings with project managers and with IT and business leaders to discuss progress in areas where significant risks might need further investigations. We'll develop and share professional resources, including project management support and templates and business analysis reports. Every CIO at every one of our universities has indicated to us that they support this more rigorous reporting and management of their IT portfolios, and they've already provided feedback on the new reporting process and templates. These will be shared in December, next month, with university presidents and with leaders in administration and finance so that we can finalize our procedures in the new year and meet our February 2025 deadline for the first round of these more robust project reports. I can yield to Frostberg or happy to take your questions, of course.
Good afternoon, Chair Lamb and Chair Solomon. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss OLA's recent audit of FSU. I'd like to thank Mr. Tannen and his team for their work. Joining me today are Al Dalia, my Chief of Staff, and Troy Donaway, our VP for Administration and Finance. Mr. Dalia was serving as acting president in my absence during the time that this audit was conducted. Let me begin by confirming and supporting what the Chancellor said by saying that I can assure you that FSU will cooperate with the OLA and its auditing teams and will be fully transparent in our actions to comply with their findings. As you can tell, my voice is a little rough, so I'm going to ask Mr. Dalia to respond more specifically to the findings.
Thank you.
Al?
Do I dare to move this? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, President Nowacek. Good afternoon, Chair Lamb and Chair Solomon and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to present an oral summary of the written testimony Frostburg State University submitted in response to the recent OLA audit. As Dr. Nowacek mentioned, at the time of the audit was being conducted, I served as acting president of FSU, and I too want to thank Mr. Tannen and his team for their very thorough work. Frostburg State University is the state of Maryland's flagship institution in Western Maryland. With that designation comes responsibility, and we take no responsibility more seriously than being a good and wise steward of the public trust, including the smart and judicious use of public funds. Since the audit was completed, we have been carefully reviewing and analyzing the findings and recommendations. We have concluded that FSU can and must do better. I am pleased to report to the committee that upon deep assessment of the audit findings and recommendations, FSU is now in full agreement with all the procedural findings of the audit conducted by OLA. I also want to assure the committee that Frostburg State University is well underway to addressing each of the findings. In the written testimony submitted, you'll find we have responded to each of the report's findings in detail and have action plans with estimated completion dates for each of the findings. The only point of clarification I want to make is that the audit mentions the loss of all $680,000 expended on the system. In actuality, the university used the system, for which we expended $680,000, for the entirety of the contract period. In fact, the implementation consultant, who was a part of that contract, was critical and irreplaceable in keeping our financial aid department operating during a time of 100% turnover in our key personnel. Nonetheless, FSU agrees with the need to significantly improve our documentation efforts, to show justification and explanation for our decisions, as well as due diligence in our processes to ensure compliance with future procurements. In the interest of time, I've kept my comments brief, so thank you for your time and for giving FSU the opportunity to present to the committee. If you have any questions or would like clarification on any issue, we would be happy to provide answers or clarifications at this time, or if you prefer, to do so in writing at your convenience. Thank you.
Thank you. So I had a couple of questions for both FSU and the system folks, but just sort of specifically for Frostburg. On the two sets of contracts, so we had the $680,000 on the financial aid system piece, and then we had the initial $640,000 emergency contract for mental health, which then expanded. Can you tell me if at any point, and obviously those are slightly different contracts, but they all there's a different set of governance that governs emergency procurement.
Right.
But then there's a different set of governance that governs sole source, and then that emergency procurement should have been standard procurement after a while. At any point, did you all notify USM and Ms. Herbst's office about the contract?
So the two different contracts and how we can. I'll
Yeah,
start
for
with
either
the-
contract, yeah.
With the financial aid contract, so there's two pieces to that, right? There's the service piece that we procured through Meek. I think it was mentioned there were 17 vendors on that list. We, as it mentioned, the TORP was optional. We didn't do a TORP on that.
What is a TORP? I was gonna
Task
say.
order, I apologize, it's a task order request. So part of MEEC is a competitively bid contract. You can request, again, the TORP, which is basically provides the details of the project, and vendors can bid on that. We selected the vendor because they were certified to install the software, and they were the only ones that were also at the time working with other state agencies. So the TORP wasn't performed. The software, we were already under contract with the vendor. We went to their new version of their software. We did this in a consultation with the system office as far as the software, because all the schools have contracts with the same vendor. So that part, the answer to that part of the contract. The emergency request for mental health services was performed during COVID. And as I believe, as Adam pointed out, that was the follow guidelines where we failed to go back and do a competitive bid. I can say right now there is an RFP out for that same service, and that is underway of resolving that issue.
So there wasn't any on either of those. So when you said you worked in consultation on the financial aid contract, that was not in consultation on the procurement side, that was in consultation with?
The software side, correct.
And so nobody identified, I mean, I remember we had a conversation about this sort of more broadly, again, in the appropriations context on the policy side of the system and many individual institutions changing their financial aid year and their academic year. I guess what stood out to me in this is that there was no conversation. It didn't seem like there was a conversation of this new software will not work with our system until after the contract had been signed.
Well, the software worked. We used it for a few years. Our situation changed. We lost a number of key personnel through sudden retirements and unfortunately one death. We were at the point where we decided to stay with the old contract, the old software, go to the new. And this is, again, I don't know how much detail we want to go, but at the time, a few years ago, we decided to go to the new version of the software. After using it for a few years, our retired financial aid director came back at a part-time capacity. We realized that we could save money by moving back to the old software. So that was the direction we chose because we had that personnel back on our staff. So we actually discontinued the new software, saving us about $90,000 a year, moving back to the old software. And just some key differences, again, I don't want to get into the weeds, but it was a cloud service contract versus an on-premise contract. So we went back to an on-premise version of the software, which saved us money on an annual basis.
So going to the emergency, the mental health contract, what internal process do you all have? And then I'm gonna ask a series of questions to USM that goes to this point as well. That it was supposed to get BPW approval and it didn't. How does that happen? And internally, how do you make sure that doesn't happen again?
Well, I can tell you how it's not happening again is I'm changing some of our processes for procurement. We're looking at, we're moving the office into this in the same building as my office. And we're looking at changing the structure within the department to ensure it doesn't happen again.
Okay. So to the USM folks, and again, Ms. Herbst, I know we started to have this conversation a little bit, and I think this will deal with I think this is a broader issue that we're going to have to discuss, I think, on the policy side of things. So can you walk me through, there's a bunch of different iterations. You've got, and I appreciate that USM's new policy that got approved this summer is that now anything over $1 million has to be approved by Board of Public Works, because that is, an extra level of approval that I think we all agree is a good setup, something that's unique for our state and a good setup to steer public dollars in the right way. But that's sort of like the entity of last resort, right? They assume that the due diligence has been done by the agencies themselves, and they're not going to get necessarily into the weeds. So I think that's a move in the right direction. I appreciate what you were saying, Dr. Perman, on the proactive nature of the regions to come back to this policy. But can you walk me through, Ms. Herbst? So, all right, anything over $200,000, sort of just, yeah.
Oh, okay. And thank you for kind of teeing that up for me in the earlier conversation. So as you said, and I'm going to talk to it in terms of what has to be notified to the system and then what has to be approved by the system. So I'll start at the lowest level. Any sole source personal service contract exceeding $50,000 has to have prior notification to my office. Not approval, but prior notification. Any sole source exceeding $200,000 has to have prior notification to my office. Again, not approval, but prior notification. Any sole source exceeding $500,000 has to be approved, prior approval by my office. And then, as you said, any contract exceeding $1 million has to, there's prior notification, and then depending on what type of contract it is, we have other requirements that kick in for approval. For instance, capital and so forth. So, but that's kind of at the basic level, kind of the notifications.
Okay. So I guess, I don't know if there's an answer to this question. I mean, obviously, I think this is where we're gonna have to work on this. I'm concerned that and I think it's shared by other folks, that by the time we see these, the contracts have already been executed, the mistakes have already been made. And I think because you all have your procurement system separate from the states, do we need to develop a better system within the regions, or the regions need to develop a better system so that USM can be more proactive, that we are not, I want to respect the autonomy of the institutions. That is one of the things that we love about our system. But again, there are certain things that I don't think we need, we can have autonomy while still making sure there's a check to know that these contracts are not being given out improperly, that there's competitive bidding. And so I think that's a balance that we need to strike, because you need to have the resources. Your office can't, we don't want you looking at literally every single contract, but what's the balance? And I think maybe we don't have an answer on that now, but I think that's what we need to be working on.
And we've talked about, there's a reason the chancellor mentioned IT and more intervention in the IT world specifically, because I think when we look at it, and I appreciate your recognition that the way the system is set up, our presidents have to have the autonomy to run their universities, and the system office is staffed accordingly.
Right.
We do some year-end checks on what's gotten procured, so we can kind of start to see whether these rules are being followed. But we're much more proactive on capital construction and IT. And I think what you heard the chancellor talk about was something that we felt strongly about, given a success we've had, which is working with some of our universities, Frostburg being one of them, to work together to implement high-dollar systems. And that's the financial and human capital system that I think Senator Hellman mentioned earlier. So when we look at the spend and look at risk from a spend standpoint, we tend to focus on those areas. In terms of the day in and day out, these are our policies that's approved by BPW. And we do have to balance the oversight, autonomy, and the resources to provide more oversight.
Okay.
I would look to my chair and my chancellor to say anything else.
I agree. I mean, you teed up the balance. There needs to be appropriate oversight, but we need to respect the autonomy that's in the law.
Do you think we need to be going more, do you need more resources to do oversight?
If we do more, there's no question.
Yeah.
and I think Ellen said it, if we do more oversight, we need more resources to do it. We have a lean USMO office.
The other question that I have, and I probably spent more time digging into the region's policies on procurement, I have it here somewhere, the liquidated damage policy section. My concern is, and I'm not a professional auditor, and I'm not a procurement specialist, but it seems to me that the problem with the policy here is that it is all, first of all, there's no requirement. And so that in and of itself presents issues, as we've seen in some of these. But because you're not necessarily seeing the contracts in advance, by the time we find out that at an individual institution's discretion, there is no liquidation policy in here, it's too late to do anything about it, and we've lost the ability to recoup any of the money if our vendors are cheating us. How do we fix that?
Thank you. I'll start. So the liquidated damage provision in the policy is the state model provision. We worked as part of the task force. The General Assembly passed the legislation to create a model liquidated damage provision in the 2023 session. We were fortunate enough to be on the work group statewide that created the provision, and then we added it to our policy manual, and it got approved by BPW. You are correct. It is not mandatory to use. We leave that at this point in our policy to the discretion of the university, the procurement officer. One of the reasons for that, and I think you'll find that generally speaking, is there are certain types of industry contracts where if you demand that, you actually limit who's going to compete for it, including, importantly, small businesses. If you think about what a liquidated damage clause entails from a risk standpoint, a company's got to, in good faith, set aside money in the case of a potential liquidated damage. So there is a bit of concern about what it would do to dampen competition, especially in small business. Having said that, the question of whether or not we need to be more rigorous in the application, I think, is a really good question, that we are committed to working with the universities to come up with an answer that is more rigorous than the one we have right now.
I was going to say.
But I don't have the answer. Right
Yeah, and I will admit, I am not, again, I'm not a procurement specialist, and I don't serve on the Health and Government Operations Committee. You know, I know which obviously is the policy entity for the state on these issues, but yeah, I mean, maybe there's a threshold, right? If you're doing a $500,000 contract, that's different than the $26 million. And so I think that's a further conversation. The last question that I had for you all is, and I think maybe it's more of a statement, but I was concerned by the popping up of the fact that our institutions don't seem to have a rigorous process for residency verification. And I believe it was, Delegate Watson's comments. Obviously, I want to make sure that we're allowing our students to be able to afford their education, but it's not like I could figure out how to cheat Pennsylvania or Virginia and get in-state tuition for my kids. I want to make sure that our residents are getting the discount that they get for their tax dollars, and out-of-state residents are paying the appropriate amount. And so I guess maybe just a more rigorous application from the USM and the regions to make sure that every institution in the system is applying those standards appropriately.
If I could comment. We agree. We believe this is an execution issue, not a policy issue. There are 26 different things that you have to prove essentially to be a Maryland resident, and that is stated in policy.
Yeah.
It's when you saw, and this is
one of our most extensive policies.
Yeah. This is a vexing issue for us because you're right, it keeps popping up as a repeat audit finding, and I believe it's an execution issue. So what we have to work on, I think, is not the policy side, it's the how do we help universities execute on the policy better.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Delegate Plakvich-Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just wanted to follow up very briefly on a point that Chair Solomon raised earlier. And I actually don't know if this is a question for the system or maybe for OLA, but the information you provided about like at different dollar thresholds, that it's prior notification versus prior authorization. I'd just be very curious to see how that compares to, say, state agencies understanding like different sections of procurement law, but I think that'd be helpful information for the committee. Thank you.
Okay. I just, I appreciate the comments of what you're going to do, but each and every one of you have business schools, you know, and the stuff that you talked about, what we're going to do in the future is stuff most businesses have to do to succeed. I'm not an educator. I'm not in the business of education, but I was wondering, how do we fix this? You have a whole lot of resources behind you to actually advise you, and I appreciate the comments of how we're setting the new thresholds, but we had those thresholds. What are we going to do to ensure, I mean, really ensure that this happens and continues? Some of the stuff you've seen by the questions today are to some of the people don't even have a business or don't really, they work for somebody else, but they understand the concept of 1 + 1 has to equal 2 at the end of the day, but that doesn't seem to be the way of operating. And I'm a little concerned that you're teaching our kids, you're the educators of our kids in business. And I'm wondering, what message is this going to send to them when we're having a conversation like we're having today?
Well, again, I take your point. We need to do better in the areas that we have discussed. I would say, again, respectfully, that we have in the system, apart from our faculty, I think we have hired people who are capable, and we need to perform at the highest standards. So I don't think it's a question of lack of knowledge. Again, it's a question of performing better.
And as we've asked before, what is it exactly we can do to help you? I mean, because this is, you guys are the ones that sending them out, everybody out there right now, you know, and that's a good thing. But this is paramount that we fix stuff like this.
Well, I think the first thing that you do is what you did here this afternoon and continue to do, hold us accountable. You expect us to be accountable. We should perform well, and we know that we need to answer when we don't. And then I will say the thing that nobody wants to hear. We would perform better in certain areas if we had more resources to perform better. I'm not embarrassed to say that, but I also realize the reality of the situation of our state.
Well, I sell real estate for a living, and I would do better if we had more houses to sell. I get that, but I don't, so I have to work within the guidelines I have. And,
I agree.
And we all have to start performing at that level, because that's important. But thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I don't envy you in what you have to go forward with. But good, thank you.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on Delegate Plakovich-Carr's line of questioning, the General Assembly has passed legislation previously that myself and Delegate Resnick had sponsored to put some better guardrails around emergency procurements and expedited procurements, but they only apply to state agencies that are not, the USM is exempted out, right? And so this may be something that we want to look at again, just to kind of follow up on her point. That there are some additional guardrails in place for other agencies when it comes to these types of emergency expedited procurements. We passed this in 2021, does not include USM. So, any other questions? Okay. I think we are at the end of our hearing. Certainly appreciate everyone's patience. It's been a very long hearing. We covered a lot of ground, obviously, and appreciated folks from Frostburg for coming out from quite a distance. To Mr. Tannen, welcome as a new legislative auditor, and to your team, we certainly appreciate all of your continued work, and to USM and our folks at UMGC as well for being here. Let me turn to my House co-chair to see if any other closing remarks before we close out.
No, I think this is it. Thank you all for your patience and for a really robust conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.